Welcome to the Atheists of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do. You should go ahead and proceed now.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me first share the screen. Sorry, my Zoom is set in Italian, so I was about to say the same phrase in Italian. All right. Now you guys can see it. I assume you can see the slides. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I needed somebody to confirm. Okay, so for the next 30, 40 minutes, whatever it is, I'm going to tell you something about character and ethics from a broad Greco-Roman perspective, not just the Stoics. And I'll tell you in a minute why I'm going to tell you that, why the Greco-Romans, I think, are important still today and they're useful still today. But first of all, let me just say, of course, that I myself am an atheist, and I've been since at least in my teenage years when I rejected Christianity and left the Catholic Church. But the issue with atheism is that, strictly speaking, it is simply a negative metaphysical position. Negative, not in the sense of bad, but in the sense of it claims that there is no God, there are no gods, there is no supernatural. Which is fine as far as it is. They're very good argument, as I'm sure you guys are aware, in favor of it. Very good philosophical arguments in favor of atheism, and it is a worldview that is consistent with the best of what we can infer from modern science. However, as such, it doesn't commit anybody to a particular view of life, a particular view of meaning, what counts as meaningful in human life, or a particular view of ethics. It is a statistical fact that a lot of atheists tend to be politically somewhat on the left side of the spectrum or on the libertarian side of the spectrum, but there are conservatives who think of themselves as atheists. So there's really no particular ethical position that corresponds or is implied by atheism. Now, that on the one hand is the good news, because it means that atheism is ideologically, politically, etc., a broad tent. Anybody can be an atheist. On the other hand, however, it kind of also, it's a limitation, because it sort of, when people say, well, so what do you believe? How do you conduct your life and things like that? Then you have to come up with something. And a lot of atheists do come up with something, of course, because they thought about this kind of stuff. And that something usually is psychohumanism. Now, I've considered myself, or some variation of that basic philosophy, I consider myself a psychohumanist for a long time, for decades, until midlife crisis hit, and my first serious problems started emerging. My father died, I had a divorce that was unexpected. There was a lot of sort of period of stress. And I reached toward psychohumanism to see what kind of resources it had in order to allow me to cope better with these kinds of setbacks or challenges. And I didn't find much, honestly. And that's when I started a number of years of research and sort of a quest, if you will, looking into different kinds of philosophies for what might or may not be useful. That quest brought me to Buddhism initially, and then to Epicureanism, and then to Aristotle, and then finally, as you heard in the introduction, I landed on Stoicism. Now, what these latter three have in common, Epicureanism, Aristotle, and Stoicism, is that they're all Greco-Roman philosophies. They're all kinds of what is called virtue ethics. That is, their focus is on somebody's character, on ethical self-improvement, if you will. So what you're about to hear about today is, in fact, what I call the quest for character, which just incidentally happens to be, of course, the title of my latest book, and we'll get to that in a moment. I'm not going to talk about the book as a whole. I obviously will be very happy if you take the time to check the book, but I'm going to give you 5 major take-home messages from the book, which I think are useful, practically useful, and give you sort of a general idea of why the Greco-Roman way of thinking is in fact still useful today. Let me start specifically with answering that question, why the Greco-Romans and not other traditions? Although we could be just having a similar conversation based on some of the Eastern traditions, for instance, Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism, it happens that I think the Greco-Romans got a lot of stuff right. And also I'm much more familiar with, for cultural reasons, with that tradition rather than the Eastern one. But we could have easily similar conversations using other traditions as a background. So there's no claim of exclusivity here implied. However, the major reasons are the Greco-Roman traditions, as I said, together with those other Eastern, at least the Eastern traditions that I mentioned, they have gotten something fundamentally right, it seems to me, about human happiness and what makes for a meaningful human life. And if you find something that is fundamentally right, then you might as well take a close look and see, how does that actually work? Second, that something that the Greco-Roman traditions got right has in fact withstood the test of time. I mean, and in fact, it has popped up in different culture at different time. So not only that, but it has actually withstood the, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, the test, more importantly, of modern science. There is a lot of modern science actually does confirm some of the intuitions in terms of human psychology and issues of happiness and meaning that the Greco-Romans had advanced. Particularly, the most popular, most successful type of modern psychotherapy, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, was actually, it's evidence-based, and it was actually started back in the late 50s or early 60s as a direct inspiration from Stoic philosophy specifically. Number 3, these traditions have not withstood the test time in terms of their natural philosophy, what we would call science. That is, today I would, if you're interested in biology or in physics, I wouldn't say go back and read Aristotle. Aristotle's physics or biology are interesting from a historical perspective, but you're not going to learn anything that you can actually bring into a biology or physics lab today from Aristotle. Unlike that, the ethical traditions in Greco-Roman thought has in fact is still, I think, very relevant today. And the difference there is that science and technology have made huge advances, as we all know, over the last 2 millennia or 2.5 millennia, especially in the last 2 or 3 centuries since the scientific revolution. Well, on the other hand, from the point of view of ethics and human nature, we are really pretty much where the Greco-Romans were. We haven't really made much of an advance, and human nature, as far as we can tell, has pretty much remained the same. That is why one of the major reasons why the Greco-Romans are relevant still today. So that was my preliminary sort of explanation for why it is that we're talking about dead people and people who have been dead for a couple of millennia and still think that they're relevant. At least that's my argument. Now let me get to the book. That's the nice cover of the book, which shows 2 characters that we're going to be talking about in a minute. The one on the right is Socrates, arguably the most famous philosopher of all time, at least in the Western tradition. And the one on the left is a guy named Alcibiades, who was Socrates' student, his friend, and it was rumored even his lover. And there is a very important interaction between the two that the book starts with, and it is the first provides the basis for the first insight that I have to suggest from the book. The first insight is, if you're not virtuous, don't get into politics. That is, we only want, ideally, virtuous politicians. We'll talk about what virtue is in a minute to be more specific. But for now, just take the general thought. Now, this is again that picture that it's a different version of the same picture you just saw, which is actually based on a famous painting that is found at the Musée Fabre in Montpellier. Now, here's the situation. Imagine that now we're back into the 430 BCE, so almost 2.5 millennia ago. Socrates at this point is about 40 years old, and Alcibiades is younger. He's about 20. The background here is that the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta had just started the year before, and it will go on for decades, and eventually it will result with the defeat and almost destruction of Athens, the weakening of Sparta, which conditions that then allowed Alexander the Great to sweep down from Macedonia and conquer all of the Greek cities. But that has to come into the future. At the moment, the war has just started. The Athenians think that they're going to get the upper hand. And Alcibiades goes to Socrates and asks for advice. He wants to get into politics, and he wants to become a statesman and a general and lead the city in this new adventure for glory and for, practical reasons. And so he basically goes to Socrates and says, what do you think? Should I do this kind of thing? Socrates subjects Alcibiades to basically a moral job interview, so to speak. And as the interview proceeds, it becomes very clear that Alcibiades is just not up for the job. He really shouldn't go into politics. He should not try to become a statesman. Why? Because he suffers from a penchant for self-aggrandizement, what the Greeks called hubris. Right? He's so full of himself, basically, but he doesn't have what it takes in order to justify that fullness of himself. And so it's going to be dangerous. If he actually gets into politics, Socrates thinks things are going to go bad, for not just for himself, but for the city, more importantly. In fact, at some point, Socrates says to Alcibiades, well, then alas, my friend, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the most extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you're leaping into the affairs of the city before you've been educated. Now, the word that is translated stupidity in that passage, it's actually better translated, arguably, as unwisdom, except that unwisdom is a little bit more unwieldy. So people typically go for stupidity. But Alcibiades was not stupid. In fact, on the contrary, he was a very smart person. But he definitely was unwise. Because if had he been wise, then he wouldn't be into self-aggrandizing, affected by hubris and all that sort of stuff. So he's unwise. Basically, what Socrates is saying is that Alcibiades, and he goes on to say, a lot of politicians, even then, get into politics for the wrong reasons. They get into it because of narcissistic reasons, self-aggrandizement reasons, not because they really want the good of the people. And they don't know what they're doing. And therefore, typically, they end up, the whole enterprise ends up in disaster. In the case of Alcibiades, that's definitely true. I don't have time to tell you much about the life of Alcibiades, but I am surprised that nobody's made a movie or a streaming television series about his life, because the guy was just unbelievable. I mean, obviously, he does ignore, of course, Socrates' advice, goes into politics, convinces the Athenians to make him general. He convinces the Athenians to open a second front in the war and go and attack Syracuse in Sicily. That turns out to be a complete disaster. The Athenian navy is annihilated by the Syracusans. That was a major setback that turned the tide of the war. In the meantime, Alcibiades is accused of betrayal and impiety, so disrespect of the gods or something. He leaves Athens, he escapes, he defects to Sparta and starts advising the Spartans against the Athenians. Then when he's in Sparta, he seduces the queen and in fact gets her pregnant. The Spartan king does not appreciate this for whatever reason. And so now the Spartans are going after Alcibiades. So Alcibiades defects again and goes to the Persians and now advises the Persians against both Sparta and Athens. Somehow, a few years later, he convinces the Athenians to pardon him and to get him back. He begins to win a lot of battles against Sparta. Then he loses a minor one. The Athenians get him, push him out again. He eventually finds himself on the run. And this painting that you're looking at depicts the end of Alcibiades' life. At some point, when he was in the mountains trying to escape his enemies, gets surrounded by a bunch of soldiers sent by Sparta, and he comes out basically naked, as you can see, with his sword in one hand and the shield in his other hand, yelling his battle cry. People are so afraid of him still that nobody dares engaging him in direct combat, and so he's killed from a distance by way of spears and arrows. So that's the end of Alcibiades. Turns out that Socrates was right. Not only Alcibiades' decision to go into politics, despite his lack of wisdom, was disastrous for himself, it was also disastrous for Athens. The second point that I want to make, or second insight, is that virtue can, and in fact should, be taught. That picture that you're looking at there is, I took recently doing a trip to Ephesus, which is in modern Western Turkey, but at the time was Greece. That's the so-called Library of Celsus, who was actually a Roman patrician, and that statue there represents virtue. So first of all, I've so far sort of taken for granted that we're talking about something that we realize, that we understand when we're talking about virtue, but let's spend a couple of minutes looking at what actually virtue is supposed to be. Here are some examples of virtue. There are 4 fundamental or cardinal virtues. Prudence, which is sometimes referred to as practical wisdom. That's the knowledge of what is good and what is bad. And if you don't know what is good and bad, or what is evil and good, then you have no idea of how to act in life, because you have no point of reference, basically. Justice is understood by the Greco-Romans as the notion that we should be acting fairly toward other people, respecting them as human beings. Fortitude, or courage, is the ability to endure something and to confront our fears, to endure setbacks if they are actually contributing to justice, and also to confront our own fears. And then finally, temperance is the ability to practice self-restraint, so to act in right measure, neither too much nor too little. Now, the word virtue comes from the Latin virtus, but the Latin itself is a translation of the Greek arete. And arete just means excellence. Now, why the hell have I put this ominous-looking knife there? Because it turns out that arete is a concept that the Greco-Romans applied not just to human beings, but to anything that had a function. So, for instance, a few days ago with my wife, we went and bought a new bread knife. That's not a bread knife right there, but that's what we got because that's what we needed. Now, what did we want? We wanted an excellent bread knife, meaning a knife that performs its function in the best possible way. And its function, of course, is to cut the bread very nicely, in slices in the way I wanted, without too many crumbs and so on and so forth. That if a knife does that, if a bread knife does that, then it's an excellent knife, meaning it's an arete knife. It's a knife that performs its function correctly. So apply the same concept to human beings, and it turns out that then to be virtuous means that you can be the best human being. You're going to be the best human being you can be. Why? Because you perform the function of a human being. What the hell is the function of a human being, however? Well, to answer that question, we have to understand a little bit of more etymology, if you allow me for a second. The two crucial words here are ethics and morality. Those two words, sometimes in modern parlance, the people trying to make a distinction between those two. But in fact, by the way, I see somebody's in the, yes, thank you. Somebody was in the waiting room. So the words ethics and morality are often used, however, synonymously. And in fact, they were used synonymously by the ancients. The word ethics does come from the Greek, ethos, and then the Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero translated that into Latin as moralis, from which we get the modern word English. Both terms, however, refer to both having a good character and the ability for social living. Because if you have a good character, then you're capable of living well with other people. So essentially, to be moral or to be ethical for the Greco-Romans meant to be able to live well with other people because you have a good character. That means, now let's all put all this stuff together, that being an excellent human means being an ethical or moral human being. Okay? And what is that? That's somebody who works on their character with the goal of living harmoniously with other human beings. And why is that? Because we're a social species. And for us, living harmoniously, cooperating with other human beings, that's the way we all survive and thrive. If we don't do that, then it's at our own peril, as in the case of Alcibiades. Now that we have a better idea, I think, of what virtue is, then the next question is, can it be taught? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. However, Socrates arrives at that answer in an interesting fashion. In one of the Platonic dialogues called Protagoras, Socrates is talking to Protagoras, who is a sophist. And typically, Socrates and the sophist don't get along very well. But Socrates begins that dialogue thinking that, I don't think virtue can be taught. I think this is not a teachable skill, because I look around and I don't see a lot of teacher people who actually are capable of teaching it. And you would think that if it was something that could be taught, then you would have teachers, because it's an important thing to teach. But by the end of the dialogue, Protagoras convinces Socrates that yes, actually, virtue can be taught. How? Well, Protagoras makes an argument by analogy, and he says, look, virtue is a techne, it's a technique, it's a skill. It's similar to learning a language or learning a musical instrument. In fact, it uses the specific example of a flute. It's a practical skill. Now, if you wanted to learn a musical instrument or a language, what would you do? Well, you have to do a few things, three things in particular. One, you need to learn a little bit of theory. If you don't know, the grammar of a language, a little bit about the grammar, or if you don't know the equivalent for a musical instrument, there is the the scales and how the notes are related to each other, then it's going to be hard for you to actually learn. Then ideally you need a good teacher, somebody who actually can guide you to learn and correct mistakes and give you feedback and that sort of stuff. But mostly you need practice. You just need to practice every day. That's the way you learn a language. That's the way you learn a musical instrument. And Protagoras convinces Socrates of the fact that that's also the way you become more virtuous. That's the way you improve your character, by exercising every day, by getting better and better at it, because you mindfully try to become a better human being. Third insight out of 5, remember. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to have some time for the Q&A at the end. The third insight is that a good character is, so to speak, an inside job. That is, it comes from inside. It's not something that people can impose on you. It's not something that they can help you develop it, but they cannot really transfer to you a good character. It has to come from the inside. Yes, you do need a teacher, but you need to be receptive to that teacher. Yes, you need to learn and practice, but you have to do it because you're receptive to it. Again, you think about the analogy with learning a musical instrument or a language. If you don't want to do it, you're not going to do it. You can get the best flute teacher and books about learning flute, but if you're not interested, it's just not going to happen. It has to come from the inside. So in the book, I explore a number of historical examples of philosophers trying to teach statesmen and politicians about virtue. And they're broadly divided into 2 major categories. In one group, it's a bunch of failures, and in another group is a good number of successes. Let me start with the failures. These are 3 examples of failures. Plato tried twice with the guy in charge of Syracuse at the time. First Dionysius I, and then later on his son, Dionysius II. Plato failed abysmally. He was in his 40s the first time that he tried with Dionysius I, and then in his 60s when he tried with Dionysius II. He failed abysmally. In fact, he almost lost his life. In the first case, Dionysius I sold Plato into slavery, and he had to be rescued by his friends who paid for a price for getting him back. In the second case, he was almost, he was thrown into prison, condemned to almost, came close to losing his life. So that was a failure. Why? Because neither Dionysus was interested in this, in the enterprise. Plato basically showed up at their doorsteps and said, "Hey, you want to become more virtuous?" And they thought, "No, I don't think so. I'm fine as it is." The third example of failure was the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the Emperor Nero. So now we're in Roman times, much later, several centuries later after Plato. Seneca was hired basically by Nero's mother, Agrippina, to tutor the new emperor. Nero was only 17 at the time. And, Seneca tried his best. In fact, for a few years, actually, things were kind of okay. But it was clear that Nero was not interested. He was interested in poetry and music, but not in virtue, not in becoming a virtuous person. Unfortunately, his job was that of an emperor, not that of a musician or a poet. And so things went down the drain very quickly. Eventually, Nero accused Seneca of being a member of a conspiracy, participating in a conspiracy against him, and ordered Seneca to commit suicide. Okay, so these are the negative examples. What do they have in common in all three cases? And there are others, of course. The people that were supposed to be learning were just not interested in learning. They were recalcitrant pupils. The second set of cases, of case studies, on the other hand, is all of people who did succeed to different extent. There's no perfect outcome here, but they did succeed to different extent. And in all these cases, that's because their teachers found fertile terrain. All of these people were actually genuinely interested in becoming a better, more excellent arete kind of human being. One famous case is Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great. In fact, in the book, I argued that Alexander became an even better and more excellent character than even Aristotle could have hoped for. The second example is Cicero, who I already mentioned, the Roman statesman and public defender, orator and philosopher. He really did try to live a virtuous life, and he did try to follow what his multiple teachers, had taught him. A third example is a guy named Cato the Younger, who was an archenemy of Julius Caesar, and he was a Stoic philosopher as well. And he tried to oppose Caesar, who was seen as a tyrant and as a dictator for many years in the Senate. And eventually, when Caesar basically declared war against the Senate by famously crossing the river Rubicon with one of his legions, Cato took up arms. You can see him there with his sword, with his dagger, and he took up arms against Caesar. The other three are also interesting examples. Dion of Syracuse was the third attempt by Plato to improve things at Syracuse, and this time he somewhat succeeded. Dion replaced Dionysius II at the head of Syracuse, and he did pretty well for some time at least. Eventually, he was unfortunately killed in a conspiracy, but he did pretty well. And that's because Dion was, in fact, a student of Plato, a willing student of Plato. He actually sought out Plato for guidance. Marcus Aurelius is arguably the most famous of this group, and, well, other than Alexander, I guess. Marcus was an emperor philosopher, and he really did try his best to live his life and practice the philosophy of Stoicism. And the last one is Julian, known often as the apostate because the Christians really didn't like him. He was the last pagan Roman emperor. He was the one that tried, actually, once Christianity was already pretty much in charge of the Roman Empire, he tried to sort of reverse the tide of history and to reestablish paganism and reopen the philosophical schools. He failed, but again, he was doing his best. Just because you're virtuous or because you're practicing virtue, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. It's the difference between your intentions and the outcomes. But Julian did, in fact, try his best. Insight number 4, we should all be philosophers. Now, notice that the word is in quotation marks. This is scare quotes. By philosophers here, I don't mean the guy on the right. I don't know if you have seen The Good Place. It's a comedy with a heavy philosophical undertone, and that guy there represents one of his the characters in the show. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's very funny and very interesting. It raises a lot of interesting questions in terms of the afterlife and ethics and so on. But Chidi, who is one of the characters in The Good Place, he's a professional philosopher. In other words, he's somebody like me. He has a PhD in philosophy. He teaches at a university. That's what he does. And so he's interested accordingly in theoretical philosophy, but he really has no idea of how to actually act in practice. And there are several episodes that focus on his comic inability to actually put into practice his philosophy. So that is not the kind of philosopher that you want to be. The kind of philosopher you want to be is the guy on the left. That's Socrates. Socrates did not have a PhD and not really studied in the modern sense of the term, although he did have a couple of mentors. But his philosophy meant, his understanding of philosophy was a way of life. What he was trying to do is to improve himself, to better himself, and to help his fellow Athenians to become better people, better human beings. So that is the kind of philosopher that we're talking about. And of course, everybody can be a philosopher regardless of whether they have formal training in philosophy or not. It's philosopher in the original sense of lover of wisdom, not in the sense of sort of an academic with a PhD who publishes papers that are read by dozen people in the world. Now, how do you become a philosopher in the practical sense of the term? Well, there are a number of things you can do. Fundamentally, you can, for instance, use the 4 cardinal virtues that I mentioned a few slides ago as a kind of a moral compass. So you ask yourself, there are different ways of doing this, but you can ask yourself every time you're about to do something important, is this prudent or wise? Is this courageous? Is this temperate? Is this just? And if the answer is yes, then you're going to do it. If the answer is no, then to at least one of those questions, then you're not going to do it. You refrain from doing it. You strive also for ethical self-improvement by practicing philosophy, as a way of life. Now, what does that mean? To practice philosophy as a way of life. It's pretty clear how you practice a language. It's pretty clear how you practice a musical instrument. But what does it mean to practice philosophy? Well, let me give you an example. For instance, let's say that a little bit of self-analysis shows you that perhaps you're not as magnanimous or as generous as you would like to be. So you need to practice generosity. How would you do that? Well, there are a number of ways, but one way might be to decide that beginning this coming week, several times a week, you get up in the morning and you put some change in your pocket, and then you go out and you give that change to the first homeless person you find, no questions asked. That will feel awkward initially. You might ask yourself, well, is this really the right thing to do? What am I doing here? Do I look like a fool? And that sort of stuff. But evidence shows that the more you mindfully engage in a new habit, the more that habit becomes ingrained. And so after a while, this will become second nature. You won't think about it twice. You just do it and go on and do a generous thing. And the notion is that is one way, one out of many ways in which you can practice philosophy. You can redirect your efforts and your behavioral patterns basically in a better direction, a better fashion, and that actually works. Aristotle was one of the first to have the intuition that repeated and mindful actions would in fact in the long run improve your character, and there's now pretty good evidence from modern cognitive science that actually does work. And then the third thing you can do is to apply something that the Greco-Romans referred to as the fundamental rule of life. The fundamental rule of life, according to the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, is the notion that certain things are up to you and other things are not up to you, meaning that your agency is active, is efficacious in certain things, but not in others, and that a good life is the result of focusing on the things where your agency is efficacious and try your best to accept with equanimity the kinds of things that you could not actually control, that are not, in fact, up to your agency. This particular notion, the fundamental rule of life, which, as I said, in the Greco-Roman tradition, comes from the Stoic Epictetus, is actually found in a number of other traditions. It's found in 8th century Buddhism, in 11th century Judaism, and even in modern Christianity. If you've ever heard of the Serenity Prayer, which was written by an American theologian in the 1930s, and which is used typically at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, the Serenity Prayer asks God to give you the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. That's pretty much the idea, except that the Stoics didn't ask God, that they thought that they could do it on their own, that they could apply the fundamental rule to their own lives without external help. Finally, insight number 5. What does and does not work when it comes to improving your character? And I'll show you a few things that don't work and a few things that do work. And here's a really remarkable case of convergence between the ancient Greco-Roman thought and modern science, because all of the things that I'm about to tell you were intuited by the Greco-Romans and practiced. We have evidence that they did practice them, and they have been, in fact, confirmed by modern research on character. Psychologists are interested in the notion of character. They're interested in how people can improve their character, and so they've actually done research on that. I suggest, if you're interested in that you look at a book that came out a few years ago by Christian Miller, who is a philosopher. It's entitled The Character Gap, which the gap refers to the notion that we would all like to be better than we actually are. And so how do you bridge that gap? So let's start with things that don't work. There are 3 things, at least, that definitely don't work. One is doing nothing. Now, this may not be particularly surprising. It's like, well, no kidding. But in fact, there are people who think that doing nothing does work. You often hear that people become wiser as they become older. Turns out that's not true. People become crankier when they become older, but not wiser. What makes you wiser with age is mindful, critical reflection on your own experiences. If you simply have experiences, but you passively accumulate those experiences, you don't reflect on them, you don't try actively to learn something from them, then you're not going to become wiser. So yes, it is true that wisdom requires age, but age is, although necessary, not sufficient to achieve wisdom, or to improve your wisdom. So doing nothing doesn't work. Don't just sit there and wait. Virtue labeling doesn't work. One of the things that is been very popular in the last few years is to implement this approach called virtue labeling, when you tell people, especially kids, that they're great, they're brilliant, they're fantastic, even though they're not, even though they're average or even below average. Well, it turns out that telling somebody that they're honest or conscientious, etc., when they're not, it's not going to work. That person does not actually become honest or conscientious as a result of that. And on top of which, that's infantilizing, especially if you do it to an adult, which a lot of modern, corporate practice tend to do. It's not going to work. It's not a good idea. The third thing that doesn't work is nudging. Nudging is a type of what is sometimes referred to as libertarian paternalism. Now, you may have seen, especially if you're a man, you may have seen examples of this kind of technique. If you go to a lot of urinals in airports, for instance, you will see that they have a little fly that it's drawn in the right place where you should be hitting. Why is that? Well, because apparently a lot of men are slopping and don't bother, urinating in the right place. But if you turn it into a game where you put the little fly so that they are enticed to hit it, and that works. That people are get into the game and they do the right thing. So that works as a type of manipulation of behavior. But it doesn't work in terms of improving your character, because it robs people of agency. They don't do the right thing for the right reasons. Basically, they do the right thing, but not for the right reason. There are, by the way, more general types of nudging that are these days employed by a lot of companies. Like, for instance, the idea that they will make it a default that you opt into health insurance, or make it a default that you opt into a retirement plan. as opposed to the way it used to be that you had to file paperwork or to check a box if you wanted to opt in. So to make it a default means that people don't even think about it. They're not bothered by wanting to change these things, and so they'll get where you want them, into the healthcare system or into the retirement system. People are just lazy. So, they don't like to. We don't like to make the extra step and file paperwork. So if you want one outcome rather than another as a company, you just nudge them in this way. Again, this works in terms of manipulating behavior, but it doesn't work in terms of making people more virtuous. Now, the good news, what does work? 3 things. And these were 3 things that were both practiced by the Greco-Romans explicitly. We have records of these, and at the same time, they also are confirmed by modern science. 1, adopting role models. So you think about somebody who you have a good degree of respect for, and who you think may be useful to keep in mind as a goal, as a point of reference, as a role model. Here's Seneca, the same guy who unsuccessfully tutored Nero, who says, choose therefore a Cato. That Cato is the same Cato the younger that I showed you, the archenemy of Julius Caesar. Or if Cato seems too severe a model, choose some Laelius, a gentle spirit. Laelius was another famous ancient Roman who was, among other things, famous for his integrity, but also was, as Seneca puts it here, a gentler spirit than Cato. Choose a master whose life, conversation, and soul-expressing face have satisfied you. Picture him always to yourself as your protector or your pattern. For we must indeed have someone according to whom we may regulate our characters. You can never straighten that which is crooked unless you use a ruler. I love that last sentence there. It's a nice metaphor. It's a nice analogy. Role models work. There is, as I said, very good evidence from modern science that they work. I'm sure you've seen people doing this. When I was in Tennessee in the South for 9 years, I saw a lot of people going around with a bracelet that said WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? That's picking a role model and reminding yourself constantly every time you look at your bracelet that that's where you should aspire to. Now, Jesus, of course, is a tough role model to follow because allegedly he's a god, if you believe in that sort of thing. So that's raising the bar pretty high. I think Cato, Laelius, or other people, in my case, for instance, I picked my grandfather as one of my role models because he was one of the kindest and more ethical persons that I know. And so I occasionally ask myself, so what would grandpa do under those conditions? And it does help because, as Seneca says, it puts a reference point to which to compare your own intended behavior. The second thing that does work is to seek or avoid situations that test your character on purpose, depending on what the situation is and depending where you are in your training, so to speak. This is from a person a philosopher that I already mentioned, the Stoic Epictetus, who lived at the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century of the modern era. He says, provoked by the sight of a handsome man or a beautiful woman, you will discover within you the contrary power of self-restraint. Faced with pain, you will discover the power of endurance. If you're insulted, you will discover patience. In time, you will grow to be confident that there is not a single impression that you will not have the moral means to tolerate. An impression here is equivalent to a temptation, basically, or a challenge. Okay. So what Epictetus is saying is that, look, you have the resources. You just have to be mindful about it. You have to test yourself little by little. Like, for instance, one way to test yourself about the temperance aspect of your character is to go for dinner out, let's say with friends, and ahead of time decide how much you're going to eat or drink and what you're going to eat or drink, and then stick with it. Right? That's a test. Are you going to be able to withstand the immediate lure of more drinking or more food or worse kind of food, less healthy kind of food, and so on and so forth? If you do it ahead of time, if you think about this ahead of time, you're going to be far better off than if you're just exposed to the stimulus basically without preparation. And then the last thing that works, not surprisingly perhaps, is just paying attention. Paying attention in the sense of being mindful. I don't mean mindfulness here. I've used the word mindfulness a number of times, and these days that word is overused. I don't mean it as it comes from the Buddhist tradition or the Zen tradition. That's a whole different kind of mindfulness. Here, mindfulness just means paying attention. The basic notion is nothing is improved by not paying attention to it. And so paying attention is important. Here's Epictetus again. He says, "Admit not sleep into your tender eyelids until you have reckoned up each deed of the day. How have I erred, what done or left undone? So start and review your acts, and then for vile deeds, chide yourself, for good be glad." What he's talking about here is a technique that is used also in modern cognitive behavioral therapy. It's called journaling, or mindful journaling, or philosophical journaling sometimes. And it is a technique which I use pretty much every day. Before going to bed, I take a few minutes and I write down a few thoughts about what happened during the day, paying attention to the kind of things that Epictetus is referring to. That is, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? And what could I have done better if something like that happens again? This is a way to pay attention to your own actions, to reflect on your failures from which you want to learn, as well as your successes, which you want to cherish because that's what you want to have more of. So paying attention, and paying attention in this particular structured way, is actually something that works in order, again, the general goal is to become arete, to become the best human being that you can possibly be. And that pretty much is it for today. That's it for my presentation. So hopefully we can have a little bit of Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much. That was quite helpful, I think. And I have to, today I have a lot to chide myself about. So.
Well, that's a good day to start then.
Yes.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of chiding going on around here, no doubt.
But I really appreciate that. I think I have to admit I was a little concerned about Stoicism, but this came out much more interesting than I thought it would.
Thank you.
And I also have to say that The Good Place is one of my favorite TV shows of all time.
It is. It was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant.
It really was. All right, so we'll open it up to questions. And anybody have a question? And I do apologize to all of you who got here late, because that was my fault for not correcting something in the meetup. But we will have the video up very soon, and you'll be able to see the beginning of this, because it helps you understand some of what he said at the end. So please accept my apologies for that. Any question? No questions?
And so the chiding begins.
Yes, you can chide me all you want.
And usually it takes a minute or two for people to start, thinking of questions or. So let's see.
Well, I've got a question in the meantime while they're thinking about it, and that is, how would you compare the philosophy of Epicurus, which has been very popular in humanist circles, particularly with that which you advocate?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So as I said, during the period in which I was doing some research, trying to figure out what sort of philosophy might be useful other than, or perhaps even in integration with secular humanism, one of the first stops was in fact Epicureanism, and precisely for the reason you're talking about, because Epicurus is very popular among secular humanists. Now, the reason Epicurus is popular among secular humanists is two, that I think mostly twofold. One, he was an atomist, right? So his metaphysics, essentially, he took the metaphysics with some modifications from Democritus, who was one of the pre-Socratics, who thought that the world is made of atoms bumping into the void, and that's a very mechanistic view of life. It's or of the universe, and so it's seen by modern secular humanists as very compatible with modern science, right? Now, It is compatible up to a point. I mean, I don't want to necessarily get into the details of Democritus' metaphysics, but it is true that broadly speaking, it is compatible with modern science. Now, of course, what the ancient atomists meant by atom is not what we mean by atom, for one thing, because atom literally means indivisible, while modern atoms, as we know, are in fact divisible. We can break them. If you have seen the new movie about Oppenheimer, you know what I'm talking about. So there were differences, but one reason secular humanists typically gravitate toward Epicurus is because its metaphysics is perceived as compatible with modern science, which is true to some extent. The other reason is because he's perceived as an atheist. But in fact, he was not an atheist. It was very clear that he actually did believe in the gods. However, what he did believe was that the gods are doing whatever gods do, whatever the gods are, and they don't give a damn about human beings or human affairs, and therefore it's useless to pray to them. And moreover, Epicurus was very concerned that people are afraid of the gods and of the afterlife, etc., because priests exploit those, they nurture and exploit those fears. And in fact, the Epicurus' advice was, forget about it. When you're dead, you're dead. There's no you there. In fact, he famously says, where death is, you are not, and where you are, she is not, meaning that, of course, there isn't going to be, we tend to think about death as something that you can experience, but you cannot, because by definition, death is the ceasing of consciousness and experience. Therefore, he said, there's no reason to be upset about it. There's no reason to be exploited by the priests for it. So you can see why that would go well with a secular humanist position. However, one thing that a lot of secular humanists, in my experience, do not appreciate is that there's a third component to Epicurean philosophy that definitely does not go well with secular humanism, and that is the following. So Epicurus thought that the goal in life should be what the Greeks called ataraxia. Ataraxia means tranquility of mind. That is, the best life you can have is one where you are serene, not bothered by anything or anybody, never suffering pain, either emotional or physical. That was the ideal of the Epicurean life. Now, one thing that Epicurus counseled very strongly his students not to do is to get involved in society and politics, because social and political involvement causes pain. Mental pain. And therefore, why would you want to do that? You don't want to do that, because otherwise your life is going to be miserable. So in other words, if you're an Epicurean, you're actually counseled to disengage from society. No political engagement, no social engagement. You really need to live in your own little garden with your friends, and that's it. That, in my mind, is exactly the opposite of what a secular humanist tries to do. Secular humanism is very much about social and political involvement in whatever way it manifests itself, but it's very much about participating in society and trying to make this world better for everybody else. But Epicurus would definitely disagree with that. Now, compare this with the Stoics. So metaphysically speaking, actually, the Stoic system also is compatible with modern science, and arguably even more compatible with modern science than the Epicureans. Why? Because the Stoics were materialists. They thought that everything that exists and has causal power is made of stuff. It's made of matter. So that way of looking at things goes pretty well with modern physics, with the modern scientific view. They thought that everything in the universe, no exceptions, is regulated by a web of cause and effect. In other words, there is no supernatural out there. There's no miracles. There is nothing that escapes the web of cause and effect. That too is highly compatible, of course, with modern science. They didn't get everything right. They thought that the universe is actually more like a living organism than a system of a set of processes as we tend to think today. So, they didn't get everything right. But a lot of the Stoic metaphysics is in fact compatible. But more importantly, it's the Stoic ethics that is compatible with secular humanism, because the Stoics thought that they were big proponents of cosmopolitanism. In fact, they basically invented the word. They inherited it from their very close cousins and other philosophical group called the Cynics, but they were so close they're kind of hard to distinguish. They were the first ones to practice cosmopolitanism, by which they meant that the right way to look at other people is, no matter who they are, whether they're strangers or family, whether they're on the other side of the world or fellow citizens, is to look at everybody else as your fellow human beings, your brothers and sisters, and you should treat them accordingly. In fact, we have even Stoic exercises that are meant to foster that kind of attitude. One of the 2nd century Stoics, Hierocles, said that we should make a habit of going around referring to strangers as brother, sister, aunt, or uncle, depending on their age, and so that we get into our mind that is in fact the way we should be treating them. Also, the Stoics were very much into political action. There is a famous group of Stoic senators and philosophers during the period of the Roman Empire, who is referred to as the Stoic opposition, because they were vocally opposed to a number of emperors, in particular Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian, who they saw as tyrants, as unjust rulers. And they were vocal about it, and they suffered the consequences. Some of them were sent into exile, other ones were killed. And so, they definitely participated into what we would today call political action. So I think for these reasons, among others, secular humanism really, Stoicism really works well with secular humanism. Another major Stoic sort of value is resilience in the face of events. I mentioned the fundamental rule of life, that notion that you need to make a distinction between what you can change and what you cannot change, and have the courage to change what you can, as the Serenity Prayer says, and the equanimity to accept, or the serenity to accept what you cannot change. I think that is something that secular humanists could definitely take on board. It's a universal principle. As I said, it's found in a number of different traditions, and it's very, very useful. It's one of the most useful things that I have found in the study of the Greco-Romans.
Well, that was a very thoroughgoing analysis, I must say. And I do appreciate the difference between the two, and the apparent flaws in Epicurus' philosophy. However, I think it's unfortunate that we do not have more of the original writings of these Greek philosophers. Yeah. Epicurus is said to have written more than 400 books, none of which have survived. It's a wonder we know anything at all about him. And the same, I expect, is true of Zeno and Epictetus and many of the others. So it's extraordinary that we've been able to pull as much as we have out from these truly original minds in the great Greek philosophical tradition. But thank you for your contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right. The estimate, I think, from scholars is that about 1% of Stoic writings actually survives. So we lost 99% of it. There are exceptions. There's one big exception. I don't know that it's the only one, but definitely one big exception is Plato, who was, of course, not a Stoic. We have everything that Plato wrote in terms of dialogues. We have the complete set. And the reason for that is because Plato was so famous and so influential in ancient times that enough manuscripts survived the Christian purge, basically, and they were copied over and over and over. And so we still have today a lot of manuscripts that go back basically to Plato's own time. But that's an exception. That's I can't think of anybody else who had, not even Aristotle. Even of Aristotle, we lost a number of books. Yeah.
Oddly enough, we can thank Islam for preserving much of what we do have.
That's right. That's pretty ironic, in fact. Yes. But yes, during the Middle Ages, which I still call the Dark Ages, even though it's not politically correct these days to refer to them, to that period that way, I still think they're pretty dark. But during that period, Europe basically shut down in terms of scholarship and philosophy and science. And that happened to be, lucky for us, the time where the Arab world, in fact, the Islamic world, was actually flourishing. They were going through their own renaissance. And that's why we have a lot of the manuscripts that survived, because they were translated in Arabic and then back translated into Latin later on. Eventually, we did find some manuscript that survived. So we don't rely only on the Arabic translations and back translations. We did find a number of, for instance, we were talking about Epicurus. One of the few, in fact, the only, as far as I know, complete book about Epicureanism, not by Epicurus, but it's by Lucretius, who was a Roman poet, and he wrote the Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. That manuscript was lost until the 1500s. And then one of the Italian humanists from Florence actually went all over Europe trying to find copies of all sorts of manuscripts, and he found the one lost copy of the Rerum Natura. Now we have 3 copies that were lost, but for 1500 years it was gone. It was just, we only had the title.
Think of the difference it might have made.
Right.
Really?
I know.
There is 2 questions in the chat. I don't know, Enrique, if you would like to ask your question out loud, or do you just want him to read it and respond?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. So you mentioned that virtue needs willingness to be taught. Can submission replace willingness when it's absent at first? In other words, can only practice imbue virtue into a person? Maybe that could be a form of nudging, which is bad according to the presentation, but that could also be seen as a form of third-party journaling. It wouldn't work for teaching emperors over whom there is no authority, but maybe it could work for children who rarely are willing and often less capable of reflection.
Yep, that's right. Actually, the big exception there are children. In the case of children, because their minds are not completely formed yet, in fact, the earlier you get them, the better it is. Yes, you can shape them. You can nudge them in a positive fashion. You can initially, as you put it, submit them to certain exercises, just in the same way in which, again, think about my analogy of learning a musical instrument, right? You can eventually get a initially recalcitrant kid to love to learn the piano. Right. Initially, the kid would be distracted and it's like, no, I don't want to sit down and do this thing. But then you kind of force him in a sense to do it. And the kid, because his mind is still pliable enough, might, I mean, there's no guarantee, of course, but it might be developing a genuine love for that thing. So yes, you're absolutely right. That is why the Jesuits, of all people, who understood very well this concept, they have a saying. They say, which goes back to their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, who said something along the lines of, give me a child of 7 and I'll give you a man of 14. Those ages that he picked are not random. Even modern developmental psychology confirms that the so-called age of reason, starts at around 7 years old. The age of reason is defined as when a child begins to be able to entertain complex, abstract thoughts. And if you start teaching that child at that age and continue until the mind and therefore the brain is fully formed, then you have a really good chance. You have a really good shot at producing a person that is in fact virtues and all that. And now the Jesuits were wrong in only one thing, and that's a good thing. It's a good mistake to make. So they thought 7 to 14. It turns out modern cognitive science says 7 to early 20s. The human brain keeps forming, keeps changing significantly until the early 20s. It stops earlier in women than in females than males, which probably explains, at least in part, why men are immature longer than women in normal development, because it takes them a few more years for their brain to sort of solidify. Now, that said, I don't want this to imply that adults cannot do it. They can, but there is where the mindfulness comes into, and the willingness comes into play. They have to be willing to it, and it's going to take more effort to do it. Again, I think the analogy with learning a musical instrument or a language is very fitting here. You know, it's not like it's much easier to learn a language or a musical instrument when you're younger, but that doesn't mean you cannot do it all the way until the end of your life. You can keep doing it, except that it requires a will and it requires more effort, and the results are not quite as good as they would be if you started when you were little, but you can still do it.
I can throw a curveball.
Yeah.
Would that not also apply to activism and social pressure for adults and even young adults?
Meaning, I mean, the answer is yes, but for example, what do you have in mind?
A sort of evil Stoicism.
Yeah, right. Yes, right. Of course, that's why Protagoras in that dialogue says you need a good teacher. Right? Yes, absolutely. People are pliable, and when they're young, and they're pliable in both directions. You know, and dictators have discovered that early on. Mussolini made a big deal in Italy in the 1930s and 40s of recruiting kids when they were called the little balillas. They were the little fascists, and he made a point of recruiting them when they were in fact 7 or 8 years old and continuing on. And the same goes for Hitler. Hitler had the Nazi youth for the same reason. Absolutely, yes. People are pliable, and now the pliability is up to a point. Modern research suggests it's always difficult to tell how much of human behavior is the result of genetics and how much is the result of environment. In fact, it's kind of a hopeless thing. You know, whenever people give you a very specific number, distrust them. They don't know what they're talking about. But broadly speaking, the modern research seems to indicate that at least half of the variability in people's characters is the result of environment. The other half, however, by implication, is genetic. And so there is only so much you can do to change that, right? So there may be very, very likely there are people who are naturally inclined toward a pro-social character, which I would say a virtuous character. And there may be a number of people who are naturally inclined toward an antisocial character. Certainly psychopaths and sociopaths are fall into that category. So how much you can actually do depends also on what you're starting with, right? You start with a certain baseline, which is sort of the genetics and very early developmental environment, and then the educational environment may be able to drive people one way or the other. But yes, absolutely, this can be used also for evil, so to produce a bunch of Nazi. Yeah.
Thank you, Enrique. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you very much.
Interestingly enough, I just read something recently that about 25% of Americans feel that a benevolent dictator is the best form of government, which is kind of scary.
Yeah, that is pretty scary. Well, they might get one in the next elections.
Yes, they might. Which leads me to a question, but before I get into my question, Zachary is having trouble with his microphone. So I am not going to attempt to read his question because he knows a lot more about philosophy than I do. So I will let you, if you could read it.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
An absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you. Thank you. My apologies for having to post my message in the chat rather than in person. Okay. It seems the microphone, and technology is something that is not necessarily under our control. Are you able to speak briefly on the link between Aristotle's eudaimonia and the ancient Greek ataraxia? I personally believe apatheia to be an essential factor in one's ability to reach an understanding of eudaimonia, and in the end, a state of ataraxia. Okay, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah.
Zachary here is bringing up 3 really important terms that I have not mentioned during my talk, but they are really part of this discussion. Arguably, the most famous and potentially the most useful is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia literally means having a good demon. So the Greeks, unlike the Christians who think of demons as evil stuff, the Greeks had this idea that demons can be positive or negative. They can be good things and bad things. And the eudaimonia is essentially a euphemism. It says it means to have a good demon, meaning a good conscience, a good character. You are, if you reach eudaimonia, you reach the kind of life, you're practicing the kind of life, you're living the kind of life that you really want to live, the best kind of life for a human being. Now, all of the Greek schools taught that the goal of life is eudaimonia, which often in modern language is actually translated as happiness. Although that's a sloppy translation, because happiness means too many things. It's a vague concept. It means too many things to different people. I think the best translation, sometimes it's translated as flourishing, but that is a partial view of eudaimonia because it tends to favor Aristotle's particular view of eudaimonia. The best translation of eudaimonia, I think, is the life worth living. So think about, if somebody asks you, what kind of life would you like to live? Well, that's your eudaimonic life. Now, the term is used also in modern contemporary positive psychology, because psychologists finally, a couple of decades ago, figured out that their job shouldn't be just to fix people who are broken in their minds. That should also be to help people, healthy people, live an even healthier life, just like analogy with a medical doctor, right? That medical doctors figure out at some point that their job is not just to fix things when they're broken, but also to avoid the things that get broken in the first place, right? So preventive medicine. So positive psychology is the psychological equivalent of preventive medicine. And it's interesting to me that positive psychologists have moved away from words like happiness, and instead they use eudaimonia, which, as I said, translates best as the life worth living. Now, Zachary here brings up a couple of other terms that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But the thing to understand about eudaimonia is that the different Greek schools differed precisely in what they thought the best way to achieve eudaimonia is. So, for instance, for Epicurus, eudaimonia is lack of pain, both physical, as I said before, and mental. That's the eudaimonic life, according to an Epicurean. For a Stoic, a eudaimonic life is a life of virtue where you behave pro-socially and cooperatively with other people. Okay, and so on and so forth. So the different schools had different notions of how you actually achieve eudaimonia, and that is actually what distinguished the different schools. Now, for those other two terms, ataraxia means general tranquility of mind. That was the goal of two of the ancient schools, the Epicureans, and the one of the two schools of skepticism, the Pyrrhonists. They thought that you could achieve ataraxia by different ways, by different routes, but they both thought that the goal of a human life is tranquility. It's like to be not not characterized, not affected by fears, not affected by worries, nothing like that. It's just you're tranquil, you're serene. That's what a good human life is about. Now, the Stoics made a distinction between ataraxia and the last term that Zachary brings up, which is apatheia. Apatheia, which is, by the way, the root of the modern English word apathy, right? But it doesn't mean apathy in the original. It means lack of unhealthy passions. So the Stoics thought that human emotions come into two different categories: healthy and unhealthy. Healthy emotions are things like love of the right kind, like love for your partner, love for your children, love of humanity, those kind of things. Joy for the right things, for the right kinds of things. Those are positive emotions. But there were also negative or unhealthy emotions. First and foremost, anger. Anger for the Stoics was a bad emotion because it overrides reason, and even when it's justified, even when it's righteous anger, it probably leads you to do things that you're going to regret doing because you're acting with rage and not using reason. So apatheia is the ideal state for a Stoic because it's a state where you're not affected by unhealthy emotions, but only by the healthy emotions. And it takes lot of practice to get to that point, of course, but that was the idea. So now the specific question was, yes, I guess I just did speak briefly about the link between these. Now, in the case of Aristotle, you asked specifically about Aristotle. Aristotle was not that as interested in ataraxia as far as I can tell, but he certainly was interested in eudaimonia. And he thought that eudaimonia, a eudaimonic life, is the result of two things. One, the practice of virtue. In this, he agreed with the Stoics. You need to, remember, by virtue, we mean arete, being a good human being, right? So being a good person is a fundamental component of a eudaimonic life. If you're a bad person, you cannot be eudaimonic. Tony Soprano cannot be eudaimonic. He cannot be happy in the Greek sense of the word. Why? Because he's a bad guy. Because he's going to have, eventually, either he's going to be cut or his conscience is going to gnaw him and he's going to make his life miserable. So you cannot be a bad person and be eudaimon. However, Aristotle thought that you also need something else. You need some externals, some of the stuff that we all think make for a happy life, like a little bit of education, health, good looks, even wealth within limits, at least, so you don't want to be poor, that sort of stuff. So for Aristotle, eudaimonia was the result of these two things: being a good person, but also being lucky enough that you have enough of these externals. And that is a crucial point here, that Aristotelian eudaimonia is the result of two components. One that is up to you, because it's up to you to be a good person. You control that. It's entirely up to you. And one that is not up to you, or at least not entirely up to you. It requires some luck. It's not up to me whether I'm good looking or not. And even being wealthy or educated or healthy, there's only so much I can do about that. A lot of it depends on circumstances that are outside of my control. That is one major distinction between Aristotle and the Stoics. The Stoics thought that the only thing you need in order to be eudaimon is to be a good person. However, they said, if you're also lucky, good for you. It's not like there is it's good if you have wealth and health and good looks and everything, enjoy them while they last, but those things do not make you a better person. In fact, what makes you a good person is how you use those things, right? We tend to think that being wealthy is a good thing, but the Stoic would say that depends on what you do with that wealth. If you use it to make your life better and help other people make their lives better, then yes, it's a good thing. But if you use it to, bribe politicians and have your way in an unethical fashion, then it's not a good thing. Then wealth is not a good thing. The same goes with health. Perhaps counterintuitively, we tend to think the health of course, it's a good thing. Well, it's a good thing if you're a good person, but I don't want to have a healthy Hitler walking around, right? So in the case of Hitler, health is actually a bad thing. It's not a good thing. So I hope, I'm sorry, that was a little long, but you did ask a fairly complex question. So I hope that kind of goes some way at least, or otherwise you can write in the chat more and I'll do my best.
Thank you. Rick O'Keefe, do you want to ask your question? Rick?
Sure. Can you comment on the effect of Stoicism on Buber and Nietzsche?
Buber, you mean Martin Buber?
Buber.
Because
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Sorry, say it again.
Yes, Buber, Martin Buber.
Martin Buber. Okay, yeah. I'm not sure about Martin Buber. He's not one of those people that I read regularly. I do know about Nietzsche, however. So the case of Nietzsche is interesting because on the one hand, he's on record as saying that he really disliked the Stoics for a number of reasons. And one of these, the major reasons, is because the Stoics were cosmopolitan. And he thought that was a really bad idea. I mean, you don't want to be brother and sister with most people because most people are awful. And so why would you want to go out of your way and try to be, sort of virtuous by way of sort of reaching out to other people in that way? Nietzsche thought that ethics or morality in general is really a construction of, it's an arbitrary construction that is put together especially by people who want to justify their own actions. And when those people become a mass, as in the case of Christian ethics, for instance, that becomes just a way to suppress the Uberman, right? The really truly good person, truly excellent person. So he was not very keen on the Stoics, and he put that in writing. So we know that without doubts. However, he also actually, whether consciously or not, endorsed a lot of Stoic ideas. One of his famous aphorisms was "Amor fati," love your fate. And that is in fact a Stoic concept, as it turns out. Epictetus says so very clearly, and in the early 2nd century, he says that we should embrace our fate, no matter what it is, because what happens to us is simply a way for us to exercise our virtue, right? So if good things happen to us, you win the lottery, well, what are you going to do with that money? How are you going to use that money? That's a test of your virtue. If bad things happen to you, you get cancer, let's say, that's also an opportunity to test your virtue, because how are you going to react to this? How are you going to be treating, for instance, the people that are there to help you, nurses and doctors and your family and stuff like that? Are you going to be nasty just because you're sick, or are you going to actually be trying to be, a good person and reasonable and all that sort of stuff? So everything, according to Epictetus, everything that happens to you is an opportunity to exercise your virtue. And because exercising your virtue is the most important thing you could do, because that's the key to eudaimonia, then you should be welcoming everything, both the good stuff and the bad stuff, both the advances and the setbacks, because they're just, he puts it in a really interesting way, in a metaphor. At some point, he says to his students that they should learn to play ball like Socrates. And what he means by that is that, if you play ball, how do you play ball? What is the point of playing ball? It's the exercising the skill. The ball itself it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the ball is made of, or what the color of the ball is, or what the size of the ball is. All of that stuff, it's irrelevant. Those are details. The important thing is the skill, is to exercise the skill. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose the game, whatever game it is, whether it's soccer or football, American football, or baseball. It doesn't matter. Sometimes you win, even though you play very well, you may lose or you may win. What really matters, however, is what makes it for a good player, for a skilled player, is somebody who always plays at his best. The outcome is not up to you entirely, because it depends on who you're playing against and the circumstances and the referee and all sorts of other stuff. But playing well is up to you. And so the analogy there, metaphor for life, is precisely that. You should embrace whatever ball comes your way, because then the issue is how you're going to play it. That is very much a Nietzschean concept, but either he didn't realize that the Stoics were saying the same thing, or he was just so focused on the negative stuff from the Stoics that he didn't acknowledge it. And I'm sorry that I cannot really comment on Buber, but I rather not comment about things that I don't know enough about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? No, I have something.
Okay.
How do we, early on you said that to go into government work or to become an elected official, you needed to be virtuous.
Right. Ideally. Right.
Ideally.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get virtuous people to run for office?
Yeah, that's a damn good question. And, one of the reasons I wrote that book, The Quest for Character, is because that question has been raised for 2.5 millennia, literally, right? The first, as far as we know, the first one to raise it was Socrates. And, in several of the Platonic dialogues, and in fact, even outside of the Platonic work, there is we have a second major source of Socrates philosophy, and that's Xenophon. Xenophon was another student of Socrates who also wrote a number of dialogues. And in those dialogues, you see Socrates giving advice to put to people, and he would say to some people, don't go into politics. You're not the right person. Do something else. And to other people, do go into politics because you are the kind of person that should do it. He himself never did go into politics because he didn't think that he was going to be effective at doing it. But he saw himself as a good judge of character, basically, and therefore he was out there advising people. So how do we do it? I think the best answer, and you're not going to be happy with that answer because it's not a, there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, here. But the best answer, I think, honestly, came from Cicero, the Roman statesman who I mentioned a couple of times in the talk. So Cicero, the distinctive things about Cicero is that not only was a philosopher, he was actually a politician himself. He became consul, which was the highest possible political charge in Republican Rome. And, he was commander-in-chief, essentially, as we would say today, as well as president. That would be sort of the equivalent of in modern terms. And he did a very good job. In fact, he did his best, and it worked for a while. Now, Cicero was very practical, was very pragmatic because he was a politician. He actually had been into politics for most of his life. So he knew that you could be as virtuous as you like, but you're going to run into people who are not, or you're going to run into people who may be virtuous but have very different ideas about what is the right thing to do, and you'll have to compromise, right? So he thought at the end of his life, he wrote a number of books about these related topics, and he thought that you need two things. You need to incentivize the right people to get into politics. That's what Socrates was trying to do. Also, you need the right institutions. Because if you have bad institutions or dysfunctional institutions, you can have all the good people you want. Things are not going to work very well. Somebody's going to take advantage of the dysfunction of the institutions, and vice versa. You can have the best institutions you want, but if people start ignoring or disregarding the institutions themselves and do whatever the hell they please, like Caesar was doing at one point, and I'm pretty sure in this group, I don't need to mention explicitly politicians in the United States who've done something like that or tried to do something like that recently, then you got trouble. So you need both. Now, the institutions, of course, means that we need the best possible constitutions you can. And we have, in the United States, I think we have a pretty decent constitution. I don't know that it's the best that you can possibly have, but it's a very good start. And as well as, and the same is true for a number of, for most Western countries, actually. The basic structure that is in place, I think that some constitutions are better than others, and political scientists could tell you certainly better than I can how to compare different constitutions. But I think we've done a fairly decent job in modern times over the last 200 or 300 years in that respect. We have not done a good job, on the other hand, in terms of incentivizing the right people to go into politics. In fact, quite the opposite. We got into a system, especially in the United States, where the incentives are going exactly in the opposite direction. There is so much money that floods the political system that and there is so much power that you can accrue with that money, that we're incentivizing exactly the wrong people. We're incentivizing the Alcibiades of the modern era instead of the Socrates or the Ciceros of the modern era. So that's the problem in part. And that can be changed, but it's going to be difficult, right? I mean, one of the things that would help to some extent, certainly, is reversing the infamous Supreme Court decision that allowed the flood of money to start coming, even anonymous money to start coming into political campaigns a few years ago. Given the current Supreme Court, I don't expect that decision to be reversed anytime soon, but there is the future, and that should be one of the goals. I mean, and in fact, it is a major goal of a lot of liberal and progressive in the long term to limit as much as possible the influence of money in politics. So that's one thing to do. The other thing, on the other hand, we're not doing anything at all, as far as I can tell, and that is teaching our kids to be decent human beings. We just don't. We don't do that at all. It can be done. There are rare examples here and there. If people have the time and the inclination, I highly recommend watching a documentary that came out 2 or 3 years ago, and it's called it's called Plato's Plato's something. I'm gonna have to look it up. Let me see if I can find it. I can't believe I forgot the title. Plato. Young Plato. Yes, that's it. It's a documentary entitled Young Plato, and it is set in a elementary school in Belfast, in Northern Ireland. And the documentary is about the principal of this school that at some point decides to teach practical philosophy to his children. Now, this is Belfast. So the children, and it's a Catholic school. The children grow up in an environment where there is still a significant amount of, anger and occasionally violence. They're taught it at home sometimes by their parents that they should be beat up the other guy because the other guys are evil, and that sort of stuff. And there are several scenes in the movie where you see this thing happening in real time. You see the teacher trying to use concepts and exercises from a number of ancient philosophies, including Buddhism, but mostly it's Socrates and the Stoics, because they tend to be the ones that are more practical to his kids. And it does change his kids. So that kind of stuff, that kind of model, in my opinion, ought to be implemented in every elementary school in the world, but we're not doing it. And until we decide to take more seriously this notion of really teaching ethics to our kids, it's not going to happen.
Thank you. Zachary has another question in the chat.
Yes, he says, if you're familiar with the work of Antonio Gramsci, yep, I am, a famous Italian political writer leaning on the communist side. Do you believe that Stoic influence played a key role in his ability to remain a force against Mussolini and fascism, even while condemned to lifelong harsh imprisonment as a result of doing so? If so, do you find this ability to stick to his guns to be correlated with the way Gramsci was shaped virtuously within his own age of reason? That's a good question. I actually read several of Gramsci's political works, but I have not read his biography. Therefore, I don't actually know whether he was even aware of Stoicism as a philosophy. The kind of behavior, however, that he displayed certainly can be characterized as Stoic in two different senses of the word. I mean, one of the problems with the term Stoic is that there are at least two different ways of looking at Stoicism. One is the philosophy, Stoicism with the capital S, which is mostly about cosmopolitanism, about cooperating with other people, about using reason to solve social problems. The other one is Stoic with a little s, which is about endurance. It's about stiff upper lip kind of thing. I think Gramsci certainly displayed endurance, so that would be Stoicism with the little s. But he also displayed a remarkable amount of courage in terms of defending his opinions and sticking to his guns, as you say, and that would definitely be Stoic in the philosophical sense of the term. Whether he was aware of it or not, I don't think matters that much. Actually, there is a number of examples of people who behave stoically, quote unquote, without actually having learned about Stoicism. I think that it helps if you learn about the philosophy, but there's a lot of what we call natural Stoics out there who essentially behave in a way that is in agreement with Stoic philosophy, which, as I said, mostly means using reason and trying to be as pro-social as possible. Those are the two fundamental tenets of Stoicism.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
We're getting very close to time to end. So anyone else have any question or comments? Bob, you have something you want to say? Oh.
No, I was just waving.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and unless somebody else has a question or a comment, I just really appreciate your time with us and how much I've learned tonight. I never studied philosophy, so I'm still just learning all of it. The other funny thing is I just bought a flute to learn how to play the flute. So
There you are.
but anyway, yeah, it's a very good lessons and a lot of great information. And I'm gonna get this up as soon as possible because I know too many people miss the very beginning and need to watch that. So
Sounds good. And thanks for having me, guys. It was a lot of fun, and thanks for sticking for an hour and a half or a little bit more. It was a pleasure.
well, it's been our pleasure too. Our next visitor is going to be an astronomer who works on the crap. Now I can't remember the name. The telescope. Can't remember the name of the telescope. It's
The
terrible.
big one.
The big one, yes, the big one. So
The James,
yeah, all I can think of is James Young, and I know it's not the James Young telescope.
James Webb.
Webb. Thank
James
you.
Webb, there it is.
Webb. Thank you, Zachary. Thank you for putting that in the chat. So we'll be setting that up soon, and hope all of you get a chance to see the beginning of this because it will help make clear some of the things he talked about. And I do apologize for the confusion, but thank you all very much.
All right.
And
Thank you. Have a good night.
No.
good
Thank
night.
you. Excellent. Make a presentation. Laugh out loud, Linda. That's funny. I don't think I could take the noise though. All right. Good night, everybody.
That would come under endurance.
Oh, yes, I know. I know. I have to make Jim practice endurance listening to my attempt to play the flute. Good night.
Yeah, that's
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.